Alright, so tonight we're going to talk about controlling exposure and the best way to improve your images. Everybody always posts online to all these subreddits and everything, like, how can I improve my images? And yes, there's a composition, and yes, there's a props and everything, but a majority of those images that are posted are under or overexposed, and that's where they're losing a lot of their quality and a lot of the pop of the colors, so I figured that would be the next best thing for us to address together. Okay. So the big thing that comes into this is our eyes versus actual digital camera. Our eyes have very large dynamic range. I got to pull this out of my school kit. So this is actually a grayscale that we used back when, I think I was the final cohort that went through my photo program, still using film. So we had to shoot these as one of our projects. And what this shows you is just all the tones from white to black, and that's the same thing our eye can see outside in the world. We can see a bright sunny day outside through our window, and also a very dark basement apartment for those who have gone through that housing cycle here in Vancouver. So the thing is, our eyes can see this whole range, but our camera can only see a part of this. So we need to pick where the information falls on our dynamic range for our camera sensor. Every camera sensor is going to be a little different, give or take how big that dynamic range it can actually capture. But with any typical exposure, you can't get the bright sunny day and also the dark basement apartment at the same time. That would need to be two exposures you put together in Photoshop. So in a lot of scenes, we need to pick whether we want the outside or whether we want the inside. And that's what comes down to where we need to control things with our aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. So on our camera, the most important tool we're going to be looking at here is our exposure meter, which is at the bottom of any view screen. They look a little different camera to camera, but there's usually going to be a 0 in the middle and a plus or minus on either side. Canon and Nikon have theirs reversed, which makes it super fun. They do that just to screw with people, and it makes my job fun as an instructor. This is what they can look like on the top of cameras. So Canon's on the left here, it has a -2 on the left and a +2 on the right, and then that little indicator kind of slides left or right depending on where it thinks the exposure falls when it's being metered, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Nikon is here on the right hand side, and you see it's got all these little dashes and then an arrow. The other thing that's fun about exposure meters on cameras is they only represent typically a 5 to 7 stop range. If anything falls without that, you know, they've got like this huge measurement here. The meter only shows out to here. So when it goes off in the distance, like in this Nikon example here on the right, they put a little arrow to let you know, hey, it's actually being recorded way over here. So far off the scale, we can't measure it. So keep in mind when you see that little arrow, or sometimes there's a flashing dash at the end, it means the register of that meter is way over here and not even on your screen. So something to keep in mind for new camera users. So I see a lot of people when they pick up their first camera, they just try and zero the meter, which is taking that little indicator, depending on what it is on your camera, and trying to get it to the center for like the correct exposure. And 0 is very rarely the perfect exposure for a lot of scenes. It's the right one for a couple, but it's not what we're aiming for. It's really about what the scene has inside of it that is important, and that's how we're going to choose where we want that indicator to fall, at least for a starting point, or at least a feedback loop to tell us what's going on in the camera, what it thinks of the scene, and where that exposure is going to fall in your histogram. So first of all, a little review on the things we covered last time about f-stops, aperture, and ISO. So aperture is one of those things that control our exposure, and aperture is the size of the hole in that lens. So as it gets bigger or smaller, so f1.4 is going to be a really, really big circle. f45 is going to be a very tiny little pinhole within the camera. So less light being let in, more light being let in, and that changes how much is actually coming onto the camera sensor. What's actually happening inside the camera is there's metal blades that close down. It's not a perfect circle because making a perfect circle with mechanical blades is a very expensive adventure for companies and manufacturers. So what they do is they use individual blades. The more expensive your camera lens is, likely the more blades it has in it. So the smoother that circle is, but it's never going to be quite perfectly smooth. Not only when we're changing aperture from big hole to small hole, we're changing how much light, we're also changing the depth of field, which is how much of the scene is in sharp focus. So over here on the left-hand example, we've got f2, which is a very big, wide open hole. We can only see the front clock, which is great. It brings our attention there. We're focusing on that blue one. And on the right-hand side, we're closing down to f16, a smaller hole. And then we can see every clock in detail. So each of these scenes might have a different use. The left one might be more for a news article, so they can put heading and text over the out of focus ones. The right photo might be for potentially like a product magazine where they want to show, hey, we offer these clocks, these are the 3 colors, they all look the same, and all the details within that. Shutter speed, so how long the actual sensor is being exposed to light. So all these little dashes here mean seconds. On your camera is going to show a little different. It goes different camera to camera. Sometimes it's a single quotation, sometimes it's double. But on the left-hand side here, we're starting at 30, 15, 8 seconds, fourth, and then we get into the fractions of seconds, like 1/2 a second, 1/125th, and more into like the sport speed, 1/1/2000th of a second, and not even on this, 1/8000th, and etc., etc. Every time we change one hitch on this, whether it be shutter speed or aperture, we're changing one stop. So from 30 seconds to 15 seconds, that's one stop in photography. So stops are how we measure light and how we deal with these three variables in the same way. So if we change one stop in shutter speed, we also have an ability, if we go back here to aperture, to also change one stop. So here the scale is a little bit different because it goes 1.4 f2, f2.8, f4. Don't worry if you don't have all these numbers. Aperture is relevant to the lens, so you might only have a lens that has a range from f5.6 to f22, and that's totally okay. But just know as you're progressing through this scale here, each of these jumps is one full stop. It's based on some math, and I don't want to get too technical in it, but basically every second number doubles. So you can see here f4, you make 2 hops, it goes to f8. Make another 2 hop, it goes to f16. Same thing with f5.6, you go 5.6, you double that to 11. There's a little bit of rounding there, f11 to 22, etc., etc. Each one of these individual jumps is one stop of light that we're changing. Okay. So the nice thing about shutter speeds is we control whether we freeze or blur a subject. We're not changing the depth of field anymore, we're actually changing the motion within the scene as long as our camera is static. So here on the left-hand side, we've got a photo of a pigeon shot at 1/8 of a second. We can kind of barely tell they're pigeons at all. We move over to the middle photo, that's 1/125th of a second. We start to get a little bit of motion blur in their wings because they're moving much faster than their bodies, but we can start to kind of render and see, like somebody asked you, like those are pigeons. And then finally here at 1/500th of a second, we've completely frozen them in the air. It's a fast enough shutter speed where all the motion is completely locked on the sensor and that quick little release when the sensor goes, and we can actually render all the detail on their wings. You can play a lot with shutter speed. It can be a really creative tool. So this person was static and still, both of those things, inclusive or. Thanks, Reddit. This person was static when the photo was taken, but all these pennants were flapping in the breeze, so they probably had a shutter speed of maybe 1/8, 1/10 of a second, and that introduced the motion of this photo without any Photoshop. Nowadays, we can do so many things in post. People like, oh, let's plate this all together in all these different images. It's always cheaper and faster to get it in camera as much as possible. Yes, a lot of things are possible in Photoshop, but it gets very expensive. You have to match color, tone, perspective, depth of field, sharpness, file quality, and all those things. You can't just kind of find something off the internet and drop it down saying, ha, we're done for the day. So always best to try and figure out how you can get it done in camera. Finally, the third thing that helps us control exposure is ISO. So ISO, this progression is a little more straightforward, just like we've kind of done numbers and times tables in school. It goes 50, 100, 2, 400, 800, etc., etc., etc. Again, every camera is going to have a different range. This range is based on your camera sensor. So aperture is based on your lens. ISO is actually based on your camera sensor. So the more money you pay, the bigger this range is. And you also at the end might have some H1, H2, H3, and L1 and L2. These are digital expansions, so the company can say, look at how big a range we have. It's like if your car manufacturer said it can go 500 kilometers and then another 10 you can walk to the gas station. It doesn't actually count. So we're going to stick with what the actual numbers say. If anything has that digital enhancement of like H or L appended to the number, we're just going to kind of ignore that and try our best not to use it because it's the same effect as pushing or pulling that file in Photoshop or Lightroom or whatever image processing tool you like. So actual numbers, that's what we're going to stick to for our ISO range. So as we take these three numbers, we can adjust up or down to see whether we want to control that exposure up and increase the amount of light or decrease the amount of light, and all in the same notches as we try and adjust to get to that happy medium. ISO, as we talked about last time, we're just affecting the quality of the file. So the higher we have our ISO 1632 and above, we're going to start to see a little bit of noise, that speckling, kind of like an old TV that has the bunny ears on it. ISO 100 or lower is going to be nice and smooth. There's going to be nice gradation in your tones. You're going to be able to walk through that image and also make it quite big if you'd like to blow up photos. So we're not actually changing what's happening inside the image, just the actual quality of the file itself. So now that we've got all these notches, we can kind of start to talk about equivalent exposures. So once we've determined what the right 3 settings are for our camera, and we can take ISO out for now because it's something we rarely use to change exposure when you're just starting off. Say the right exposure for a photograph was f11 at 1/60 of a second. One stop lower than f11 is f8, so I'm making the hole twice as big, but I'm going to shorten up the shutter speed. So as you can see here, I use these kind of like 4 bricks of light. We're taking those same 4 bricks of light, they're all hitting the sensor, but they're just hitting it in a faster speed because that shutter speed has also been adjusted with the aperture. We go one more stop and open up even further with f5.6, so an even bigger bucket or hole where the light can come in. And then we can have an even faster shutter speed, so 1/250th of a second, and we're still going to get the exact same exposure in all 3 photos. You can try this right now with your camera. I can't promise you it's going to be the right exposure for you sitting at your desk, home, office, wherever it may be that you're watching this video, but I can guarantee you that all 3 of these photographs will be the exact same brightness level as long as you're pointed at the same object, same direction, because these are all equivalent exposures. The reason this is important to be aware of is because every photographer has a different use case or genre that they're shooting for. So for example, the f11 1/60th of a second, that photographer might be doing architecture or interior photography. They might have all the time in the world, they might not need a really fast shutter speed, and they also need a lot of depth of field. So that f11, that tiny hole, allows everything to be sharp front to back in their photograph, and that's really important for their clients, whether they be architects, interior designers, things like that. The photographer that's maybe shooting portraits or sports with moving subjects and kids or dogs chasing around, they probably want a faster shutter speed. So they're going to be shooting this photo at f5.6 at 1/250th of a second. And they're going to get the same exposure as the other photographer, but what they're going to do is be able to freeze that motion, kind of that like, I want to say like slobber from the dog is my first analogy coming to my head. And also the benefit they're going to get is a really shallow depth of field. f5.6, only a part of the scene is going to be in sharp focus and everything else behind them is going to be blurry, which kind of draws all our attention to the user or viewer. And the subject in the scene is going to kind of pop off the background a little bit more. Again, every photographer has the same tools. We use these tools differently depending on what our end goal is for that photograph. Do we want to have a lot of depth of field? Do we want to have a shallow depth of field? Do we want it to be completely sharp? Do we want a little bit of motion blur to our elements? All these things are the teeter-totter we play with as we start to arrive at good exposure for our scene. The one analogy that's always kind of used for me in classes was it's a bucket. So if anybody's seen like a liquor board ad and they say like, you know, the wine glass is this much and it's this much alcohol, but the pint glass is this much and it's this much alcohol. Similar analogy here, but essentially long flute glasses, skinny, or we can have short and fat and the same amount of light comes in. So everybody has a different way to approach and understand this, but if you have any questions, feel free to fire away. Okay, so we've got those 3 things to control light, and you're probably wondering, I talked about the exposure meter, how is it deciding where on that scale it falls? And this is where light metering modes come in. So your camera is going to have multiple light metering modes, and it wants to average everything. So when you look through the lens and you can see that little box, it's measuring a part of that box, and it's trying to average it all out to give you kind of a nice baseline to measure from. So ideally, your camera wants to shoot a picture of a gray card. This is what we used back in the film days, and this is the camera's dream, is having a perfectly 18% gray card facing us, because it's going to be a neutral tone. It's right at 50% between white and black. See right here on this little thing I showed, I'm going to go through the back, see this M, this is the middle gray, this is what its dream is, because that's going to result in perfect exposure. If you fill the frame just like this, and then 0 the meter, you would have perfect exposure for whatever scene you're looking at. Now, given not everybody has a gray card with them or wants to tote it around and they work in different lighting situations, let's just kind of talk through what it looks like in the real world. So I took this photo when I was over in Toronto. It was just this kind of cool street shop, and I thought the signage on it was really good, and somebody just jumped in front of my camera, as people do when you're doing street stuff. But I thought this was a really good example of how to keep the realism of exposure in a street scene. So here there's a whole bunch of tones. There's highlights in the white brick, there's some highlights on the roof because the sun's reflecting off it, there's some dark tones on the kind of graffiti and art on the walls and also the signage, and then the street is this nice kind of middle gray tone. So we have this huge range from white all the way to almost black, and as the camera looks at this, it's going to be like, oh my god, there's so many tones. But the benefit is, if you average everything out, it almost gets to gray, and I'm going to show you what that looks like here. So I just took this quickly into Photoshop, switched it to black and white, so we take color out of the equation. Again, let's not make things more complicated than it needs to be. And then I just started blurring this photo a little bit. So as I start to blur it, I'm just putting a filter over the whole thing. And you can see as all those light, bright tones meld into the dark ones, we get about to middle gray. So you can see this is the blended blurred photo. This is a gray card. They're not very far off in terms of brightness. So when you're shooting a street scene, you're going to be somewhere in the middle, as you can see on this scale here. While 0 isn't always the right answer, when there's a big range from dark to white and all those midtones or anything in that gray section, that's where we want our exposure meter to be. If it's a white on white scene, we've got all these products like these nice staplers and everything, or just a white piece of paper, we want it to be at +2 or +3 on our exposure scale. Last but not least, if everything's dark or black on black, like this kind of speaker set or just a big black piece of fabric here, we want it to be -2 because we want to represent those tones accurately in our scene. In the middle here, that's what our camera is kind of designed to easily deal with. It always takes the scene and says, hey, I want to average this. If you're on anything but manual exposure mode on your camera, it's going to do its best to kind of average the scene. Unfortunately, that's not always the best answer because not every scene is average. Like this one I shot and happened to get is right around average. Happened onto it and it's a good teaching example. But you might have a scene where the building's bigger and whiter and less of the scene is dark, or the scene is darker and it's a big dark building. There's no white whatsoever and you need to adjust accordingly. So that's why somewhere in this scale from -2 to +2 is going to be the right exposure. And you need to use your intelligence and just understanding of how your camera works to adjust and understand which part of that scale your exposure needs to fall in. So this is a good example here. So lighter than average scenes. We've got these white picnic benches by this tourist spot close to my house. And here you can see on the left, that's what the camera thought the right exposure was at 0. Because again, it's trying to make everything gray. It looked at all this and like, oh, we need to adjust and take away light because it's too bright. We're going to make it really nice and gray. When in reality, it actually needed +2 stops of exposure added to it so that white would actually look good and pop. So when you look at each of these photos, no, they're not great photos. They're good teaching examples, but you can see how big an impact this would have if it was the white fur on your dog or the white wall in your house. On the left-hand side, it just looks really muddy. Yes, you can maybe see a little more detail in the table, but it doesn't make for the most appealing photo, which is why exposure is such an important component to understand very early on when you start to get into photography. If you get the whites right, if you get your tones correct, it's going to look like it did when you looked through your camera and your human eye saw it that way. If you don't, you're going to lose a little bit of that detail. You're going to lose a little bit of that pop and saturation from those colors. We have a dinner here in Vancouver called Dinner en Blanc, so lots of people dress up in white. They get very fancy and get notified of a location like hours before it happens. But this is a good real-world example of why you would need to expose a white-on-white scene. I know a lot of photography textbooks say, oh, you know, if you're shooting a polar bear in Antarctica, I don't think they live there, but it could be a possibility because it's a textbook. No, you're not always going to have a white-on-white scene, but you might go skiing with friends on the weekend, and that's going to be a big white background, and if it's overcast or cloudy, the sky's going to be all white too, and your camera's going to be underexposing everything like crazy. So that's why it's really important to understand. If you're looking through your camera and you see white-on-white, think, oh my goodness, I should probably overexpose this. At least 1 to 2 stops, if not more. Again, not all white tones are created equal. There is a spectrum of them. You can see here at the top end. We need to understand how white is and then expose accordingly. Same thing goes for darker than average scene. We've kind of got a black candlestick holder, but again, the camera thought, oh my goodness, I need to really up this exposure because these are really black and dark and I need to get them to middle gray. So you can see we overexposed these feet and they don't have the kind of like depth and inkiness that they actually do in real life. The actual correct exposure was -1.5 stops on our camera. Again, it's looking to average things out. It doesn't know what's in front of it, so it's making its best guess based on the tonal information bouncing back into the camera sensor, and a whole bunch of things are happening behind the scene. But dark and dark scenes, underexposed 1 to 2 stops. Again, dark night, if you're shooting sports and you have a dark-skinned athlete, it's a good example where your camera would really completely blow out all of this because it thinks, oh, I want to get this to middle gray. I want to increase the amount of light hitting the sensor so I can get to that middle gray. Your camera doesn't know best all the time. These are very fringe situations where it's going to fail, which is why photographers still have a job to make and a living to be made of this, because they understand, they look at the scene and go, oh, my camera's going to make the completely wrong call here. I shouldn't have this on auto. I shouldn't let it decide because I'm shooting a very unique scene here. So I mentioned metering, and when you look through your camera's actually looking at certain parts of the scene to understand what it's measuring. For me, I'm on matrix or evaluative 99% of the time. Center weighted and spot, I think, cause more problems than they actually help with metering, so you can ignore those two elements. We always want to be on matrix, evaluative. On SAM cameras, it's called average metering. So with matrix or evaluative, it's really nice because you're training for a consistent look through your viewfinder here. You're looking the top left-hand corner all the way down to the bottom right. Everything in that scene, if that's street scene in Toronto, it's getting measured and then saying, hey, I want to take all these tones, average them, and you tell me where the meter falls. Is it -2 right now based on my settings? Is it +2? Do I need to change my shutter speed, aperture, ISO? Where do I want that to fall? So I think matrix evaluative / average for some cameras is the best one to be on for a beginner. Center weighted and spot just kind of makes it too possible to have a failure, because if we take spot metering, it's just like a circle here in the middle of the scene. If you metered this and said, hey, is there a Curtis in this room right now, and you look through the circle, the answer would be no, but it's not correct because it's sampling such a small area of the viewfinder. Whereas if you have matrix or evaluative, it's actually looking this whole screen over here, so you get every single tone you're actually looking at through the viewfinder, so the measurement is much more relevant and accurate for the scene that you're shooting. So once you take the photo, you're going to have that feedback on the back, and your histogram is going to pop up, hopefully, if you watch my last video. These are some examples of what histograms could look like depending on the scene. So on the left-hand side, we've got all these spoons that are kind of middle gray tones. Again, these are black on white just to make things a little easier. Color can be a part of the conversation down the road. We do have some darker tones there, but there's a pretty big range of contrast left to right. There are some dark shadows, but there's no like bright white highlights, so you can see the information kind of falls off towards the right-hand side because there's not as many bright objects as there are dark objects in this scene. In the middle here, we've got that kayak on the really dark water, which is a really high contrast scene. There's no middle tones at all, and there's just two big peaks on either side. We've got the dark colors of the water, and then we've also got the bright tones of the kayak and also the paddles and person's jacket. So you can see no info in the center. Again, there's no shape we're looking here for histograms, but it's interesting to understand what we're looking for in the data. If we shoot that canoe and we see, hey, how come the black water is in the middle and it's represented as a gray? You can see probably the exposure wasn't the best in that photograph, because we're also going to lose the canoe at the same canoe / kayak, top-down boat, floaty boy. Next on our scene here, we've got low contrast, so we've got this kind of overcast day and a big gray car, a little bit of shadow underneath, so you can see to the left hand side there's a little bit of data there of the darks, but there's no bright highlight here, so there's no information kind of peeking to the right hand side like in the kayak photo, or floaty boy as it has now been dubbed. So every scene is going to come off a little different. We just need to understand as we change exposure, that histogram is actually moving that data left and right depending where you've chosen the shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. As we increase the light, we're going to move the histogram to the right towards the right-hand side, and as we decrease, we're going to move it to the left-hand side. Okay? Left-hand side is where all your darks are, right-hand side is where all your highlights are. This is a good example of the same scene here that I pulled off the internet. So it's just a very tired dog on the carpet here, but very dark dog, very bright carpet. So it's one of those scenes where the camera's going to go, well, it's average, so I'm kind of going to go here-ish. And you can see it's the same mountain and valleys here in terms of the size and shape of the histogram. The underexposure, all the information was pushed to the left where the dark tones are. We've kind of lost what the carpet actually looks like in real life. Once they corrected the exposure, you can see all the information is falling within those field goal posts that are our histogram. If we overexpose things, that information actually gets pushed off the edge. We can't even see it register, and that's where we're starting to lose detail. Overexposure is so much worse than underexposure in digital photography, because once those details are gone, they're very difficult to recover. It's also really important because a lot of people come into this, they shoot clients doing a headshot with like a white t-shirt, or they do weddings and it's obviously always, 99% of the time it's a white dress. And if you lose detail in that dress, it is very difficult to get back in post-production. I know there's definitely software out there in the comment section might go crazy and call me an anarchist, but you want to shoot this correctly to ensure those details, that investment they made in that beautiful dress and the beadwork, sequins, hem, stitching, fabric, all those things are really captured accurately in the correct brightness. If they're not, your client's going to look at you and be like, there better be an amazing background in that photo if the bride is overexposed or their dress is overexposed. Not a good day for anybody. Finally, one thing I wanted to touch on before we wrap up here as we talk about exposure is white balance is going to be a factor when you're looking at these images. A lot of people say like, oh, like exposure and white balance, they mix up what the results are and how that changes their photographs. So white balance is how we interpret light on our actual photos when they're taken. So this is a very technical color temperature chart in kelvins. No, you don't need to memorize this. I certainly don't. But what we can see here is the higher the temperature is, the bluer it is, the lower the temperature, the redder it is. So noonday sun is what daylight white balance on our camera is based around, and it's around 5,500 Kelvin-ish. Again, big photography nerd, but we don't need to get into this. What we do need to understand is the range of light we could potentially have for our camera from natural sources, including the sun and shade, range anywhere from very, very warm and red like candlelight to very, very blue like daylight. We don't see it with our eyes because, again, these are amazing tools that evolved over generations, and we change it immediately as soon as we walk out of the house, as soon as we walk down the street into a building. Our eyes are adjusting for color temperature all the time. We need to tell our camera, though, what kind of situation we're in. So these are the kind of settings you'll typically see. You'll have auto. Please don't use auto white balance. It's like giving your this is a terrible analogy. It's like giving your 3-year-old a crayon and saying, hey, pay the bills for this month. It's not a good idea. They don't know what they're doing and they're making their best guess. Maybe, but anarchy. We want to pick the actual scenes, whether it be daylight, you're shooting the subject in shade, it's a tungsten light, it's a white fluorescent light, it's custom, and you know exactly because you looked at the bulb, the color temperature of that bulb. You don't need to go that crazy. I only know a couple of photographers that do. But these help the camera interpret the colors accurately when it actually takes the photo. I've shown this photo before, but there's different uses for each of these photos. On the left, you get a really nice feel. This is a tungsten scene shot on daylight white balance. So it's not correctly balanced for the scene, so all those warm tones are coming through. But if you're doing a street scene and saying this is what it's like to be at this night market, this could be a great photo and really represent what it was like to be there in person, and the editor of the magazine or where you're posting might love that. But if you're trying to sell white smocks and the white smocks don't look white, not the best example. So we really want to make sure in the right scene, this is a tungsten light with a tungsten white balance. So it's neutralized the color there to make it actually look how it would in the real world if there wasn't a color impact on the image whatsoever. Okay, so a little homework project for you. I'd like you to take your camera and shoot a 5-stop range of the exact same scene. If you have a tripod, great. You can pop your camera down on that tripod and then just bang off 5 photos. If you don't have a tripod, I'd recommend using something stable, just like a desk, a coffee table. You can shoot it in your kitchen on the counter. What the scene is of doesn't matter, but the results do. So what we're hoping to see is something like this. We're going to control aperture, shutter speed, and ISO to shoot a photo at each one of those stops on your exposure meter. And most exposure meters will go from a -2 all the way to a +2. And we're going to take a single photo, changing those settings to each one. If you can do this, you can solve 90% of the exposure problems out there in the world, because what you can do, even if you don't know what the correct exposure is, you can shoot a bracket, this is called a bracket of images, and say, hey, well, looking at this, -2 is obviously not that great, +2 is maybe a little too bright on the blinds, and I'm getting a little too much saturation in the trees and bushes through when I look through that. It looked a little more like +1. That's the correct exposure for the scene. So rather than shooting this on a Polaroid and making a guess like we would in film days, this is how you can do a quick bracket and understand where the correct exposure is going to be for your scene. So I did a quick example here. I just shot this in the corner of my apartment with my very big whiteboard and very white Venetian blinds. So this is what it looks at -2 stops, -1, 0, +1, +2. So again, the correct exposure for the scene is probably between +1 and +2. At +2, I'm starting to lose a little bit of detail. It's starting to bloom out and lose some of that tone and texture in the walls and also the ceiling. So you can make your judgment call about where you think the right exposure is, but the whole point is to get 5 photos with 1 stop difference each. If you need to know what the stop differences are, you can go back in the video to see where it is for shutter speed, ISO, and aperture. So again, when you're out there with your camera, it's important to look at scenes and understand where they actually fall on your exposure meter. If it's middle gray or very average, there's lots of darks and lots of lights, it kind of looks like a yin-yang, there's a good balance between them all, your exposure meter should be around 0. If it's dark and black on black, you want to be -1, -2, white on white or bright, +1 or +2. Okay. All right. any questions, comments, or queries? One piece that's always asked of me when people are making exposure changes is how come the aperture is changing as I'm zooming the lens. Some lenses don't have the same aperture all the way through the zoom range. You'll see on the front of the lens it'll say 1 colon rather, and then like 4.5 to 5.6. What that's telling you is actually as you zoom the camera lens, it's going to adjust the aperture for you. You don't have control over this unless you're set to already a smaller aperture. So if you have any exposure changes and you're not really sure why or how they're happening, you can just take into account, hey, maybe it's the zoom factor on this lens, so I'm going to pick the same focal length for the whole project, and then you're not going to have any of those adjustment errors. All right. Tried to keep it a little shorter this evening, and I hope you get out more shooting than more listening to me, and I will see you at the next one.